Productive Pastor 57, Pathways with Fernie Rivera. What's going on, friends? Chad Brooks here, Productive Pastor, here with another episode, and one that I'm really excited about, one that I've been trying to get going down the pipeline for a while, and I want to do it face-to-face with my buddy Fernie. We're going to talk about discipleship pathways. This is actually going to be a two-parter. We're going to get into some of the theory and the idea in this episode. The next week, we're going to come back, and we're going to build out a pathway. And now this is part of the whole systems conversation, pathways, all this sort of stuff. It's all lumped into the same idea, but in essence, what it is about consistently thinking through each step of a journey. Now, many of you know I've been doing a lot of research the last few months about congregational growth and what does church growth look like for the normal-sized church post-COVID, all these sorts of things. And what I keep coming back to is this idea of, do people know what does it mean to belong, to engage, to be formed, all of this sort of stuff. And my buddy Fernie is the best person I know to talk about this. Now, before we jump in the episode, I'm going to talk about this in the interview, the conversation, but he has a fantastic free resource all about learning how to do this. The link will be in the show notes, revchadbrooks.com/PPP/057. Make sure you go hit that link, grab that free resource he has, because trust me, it's something you're going to want to know about. So we're just going to stop right here, and we're going to go into the conversation I have with my buddy Fernie, pastor of Mid-City Church in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, good friend. Second time he's on the podcast, and I'm super stoked to share what he has to say with you. Well, Fernie, welcome. I realized this when I was walking in your office today. You were the first person in this new iteration of Productive Pastor to be on the podcast twice in a row.
Oh, that's exciting. That's a big honor.
Well, it should be, Fernie. You're a great guy. If y'all didn't listen to Fernie's older episode we did during the Pandemic Pastor series, he gave a story about the church he leads, Mid-City Church here in Baton Rouge. I'm sitting in Fernie's really cool office. I can't say office compound.
No, but it's fair.
Fernie has one of my favorite offices ever. So every time I come here, come see him here. But, you can go back, listen to an episode, hear about the story of Mid-City. But we talked about a little bit on that episode about the power of discipleship and leadership pathways. And he is my go-to for this sort of a thing. I've been thinking about it for a little while. He's been doing it for a little while, and actually a long while by now. So we're going to have Fernie on 2 episodes. This one's me kind of introducing the idea of pathway thinking. And then the next episode, we're going to build a pathway together as part of the podcast. So, Fernie, welcome back to Productive Pastor.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So we'll just kind of jump into it because folks can get into the previous episode. But give us the 30-second story of Mid-City Church.
Yeah. So Mid-City Church was supposed to launch March 15th, 2020. Yeah, that's the weekend everything started shutting down. And in particular in Baton Rouge, all our schools shut down, which is where we were going to launch out of. And so we were left not having a building, not having a place, not having anything. Our main campus shut down, so we shut down as well. And our launch date was going to be God knows when. So in that process, we had to figure out how do we disciple people without the traditional model of having people coming to the church every single Sunday, right? Everybody was going online and doing that part, but we were trying to figure out how can we help people go deeper in their faith when they've never come to worship together or been in a small group together or done anything together. So that was what came out of the pandemic was we started developing pathways, systems, these next steps for people to go deeper deeper in their faith, so that we could genuinely help people grow in their faith and not just put a worship video out on Facebook or YouTube. And since then, Mid-City has launched. Now we have monthly gatherings that we call large groups. We meet every single month. We have weekly small groups that meet all across town. And it's launched. What once we thought might never launch is now launched, and it's a church.
And y'all are out of the toddler phase by now, because y'all been launched for a few years.
Yes. We really started doing a lot of work in 2020. We launched fully in 21, so we're past the toddler.
Yeah. And if you heard him say that and you're questioning, you did hear that right. Mid-City gathers physically for worship once a month.
Yep.
but has small groups that run all throughout each week. That's one of the many of the unique things about Fernie and Mid-City. That's one of the things that I just think is important to pay attention to. But I remember me and you had barbecue before the pandemic, and you were already thinking about pathways. So your idea of pathway is older than just a COVID response mechanism.
True. Yeah.
So what had you thinking about this idea of pulling levers as part of leadership and discipleship?
Yeah. Well, full disclosure, when I was in college, I was leading worship at a church. And I had this idea that if we could just have Sunday morning be perfect, like great music, great sermon, great lighting, then people were going to grow deeper in their faith. And I found myself doing that over and over and over again with different teams, different places, different churches. And a lot of times we weren't seeing people grow deeper in their faith. They were just showing up to church, listening to good music, listening to a good sermon, sitting in comfortable seats, and then going about their lives. Yeah. And I realized helping people grow in their faith, discipleship, has to be intentional. We can't just show up on Sunday morning, preach a sermon, and hope that people are going to grow in their faith.
Yeah.
And so we developed these pathways. We started developing these pathways as a response to, let's see what happens if we're intentional with people's faith journey. Like if we actually provide, like, here's where we get started. Here's what you do next. Here's how you can go deeper and deeper. Will people actually grow deeper in their faith, or will they just keep showing up to Sunday morning worship? Yeah. And what we realized was people were actually growing deeper in their faith. I mean, when there was this clear path for them to follow, they were actually growing in their faith, and they were asking questions, and they were starting to become leaders. And really, when we started putting in place at Mid-City, like that's the whole reason the church ended up launching eventually, because we had these pathways in place that people were journeying through. And again, their faith started growing. They started becoming leaders in the church, in the community, in their jobs. And so, yeah.
Yeah. I can't remember if it was Mike Breen or not, but I think it was Mike Breen said, if you create the church, you don't always get disciples. But if you create disciples, you always get the church. Yeah. And my background, especially 8.5, 9 years as a church planner, and I think a lot of times, I'm older than you, but I kind of came of age in the same idea: make everything excellent, make it enjoyable, make it relevant. That was the hot button word when I was in my 20s. All these things, and you will have this church. But, I mean, I know from personal experience, like that does not always create anything sustainable. In a lot of ways, you're just chasing the previous Sunday. And it's a fallen system. And COVID really accelerated people realizing that, just an enjoyable experience isn't enough to say that, much less asking the questions. And I remember, this was years ago, I was early in seminary, so it had to be 2007 or 8. But I remember Willow Creek and Bill Hybels. We can't talk about Bill Hybels anymore, but they came out with a study and pretty much said, we realized we've grown massive, but we've not made any disciples. Yeah. So people have been realizing this for a long time and jumping onto it. So what is, like, explain from a simple way, because people might be realizing that they've heard the word pathway, it's kind of buzzy or this sort of a thing, but line out, like, okay, what is a pathway? Yeah, for people in the church scenario, either discipleship or leadership, whatever that is. What is a pathway?
So very basic. A pathway is, I tell people there's 3 parts to it. First part is, what kind of person do you want to develop with your pathway? So that's like your end goal has to be important. Yeah, you have to have that very clear. Then you have to start off with where are people, the majority of our people starting off at, and then once you know the beginning and the end, we find steps along the way to connect you from where the people are starting to where you want them to be. So I think one of the problems with pathways is that sometimes we think, well, we're just going to create a process for people to come back. Well, that does work, but if that's where we stop, then give away free iPads and people will come back, right? Yeah. So the pathways for me are an opportunity to intentionally help people grow in any way, shape, or form. So like we've got pathways for how do we develop leaders. We have pathways for once people start showing up, how do we get them to become members of the church? We have pathways right now for, we actually just did this one a couple weeks ago. How do we identify people who are new to the church and are willing and are willing to be early adapters to what we're doing. And the things that we've been doing with the people so far, some of the things that have worked, some of the things that seem consistent with all of them, and we're creating that pathway so we can continue to identify more people to be early adapters to help us continue to make an impact in our communities.
So, okay, when I was in what's Katie's title right now, Fernie?
She does everything.
She does everything. So I've known Katie almost as long as I've known Fernie. And I was in her office earlier, and I saw that you had the whole early adopter. I was like, I wonder what that period.
Yep.
So you're thinking through right now, how do we identify people that would be early adopters to specific parts of Mid-City, and how do we make sure to connect them to the places?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh man,
Yeah.
That's podcast brain. Wow.
Yeah. So for people who don't know, right, the early adapters are people who catch on to the vision before most people do, and they're usually the ones who will reach out. The late adopters, they're usually the ones who will reach out to them and get more people connected and involved and active. Yeah. So we decided, how do we identify those people, and how do we get those people to help us really take charge in not just reaching new people, but really adapting to what we're trying to do to this vision early on. And so we sat down and we made this huge list of people who we've identified as early adapters, people who were a part of what we are doing at Mid-City before we even were a thing, right? Before we even had everything clear, people who were already on board, willing to help us out. And then we started asking ourselves, what do these people have in common? What did we do with them that helped them get us connected as we did? And we identified 5 things that they all have in common. We've made a pathway out of that. And as we have new visitors, we're going to try to walk them through that pathway.
Yeah.
And not everybody's going to go all the way through.
No.
But the ones we do, we know they're early adapters in what we're doing.
Well, and you also, if you think about that as far as just personality theory and that sort of thing is concerned, if you have people that have a really particular way of moving. Yes, sir. My phone doesn't understand my question either. So if you have people that's really the thing that they are deeply, deeply passionate about, since I was in a church plant for 8 or 9 years, there is a necessary drop-off point at a lot of church plants when things begin to normalize and how to kind of start staying somewhat expected. And a lot of those drop-offs you see are the people that are extremely enthusiastic about first-level movement. And I think that, identifying those people and maybe early on, but also probably maybe the people who've been around with y'all for a couple of years, realize, okay, they tend to express passion in new things. And if you think about that framework, that's where my mind explosion came from. If you think about that framework, especially in an established church, there's a lot of folks that are listening to this are in established churches. When you realize, one reason we might struggle with people sticking at our church is you get people who are really looking for forefront level things, and they're just simply not there. Like I was talking to a colleague last week and said they had a Sunday school class. The Sunday school class celebrated its 70th anniversary. But if you got people who are really looking for, there are certain folks, and I know we use the word a laggard. It's kind of a cut down, but in that mental model, laggard just means people that are really comfortable with extremely proven things.
Yeah.
And they don't get any positive energy off being an early adopter or a late adopter or an innovator. Sometimes we might be thinking, are we still offering things for the people who really like stuff to be established and known? Man, that was a little rabbit trail sidebar there, but the fact that you are thinking through that is just so you've got the beginning part of this is where our folks are right now. And what's interesting was where you started at was this is where we want people to be.
Yeah.
Is that initial starting place?
Yeah, that's I think where we have to start all the time, right? What is the outcome of what we're going to build, and then go from there. So for us, that pathway that we're talking about, it was about how do we. So we've been sending out a whole bunch of emails to people about here's the next service project, or here's the next thing, and here's that. And the response, it's good, but we want that number to be higher. And so as we were talking about that, we realized the people who show up, right, is that group of people. So how do we identify those people quickly? So that's where that pathway came out of. We figure out where we want to end, what's our outcome, what are we looking for, and then where are most of these people starting. So for us, it's first time they come to a small group or a large group, and then what are the steps in between? So yeah, if we start, I think if we start with first time guests, we can go, I think our steps can end up wrong if we don't know what the end thing is, right?
Yeah.
So we can say, well, we want this here and then this there and then this next. But those three things might not, those 3 steps or 4 steps or whatever they may be, they might have nothing to do in common with each other. And so you're just kind of like throwing spaghetti at a wall and hoping something sticks.
Yeah. Yeah. So that end goal, which is, I mean, you've heard me talk about this a long time. I always think through the benefit of doing backwards. Like there's preferred future thinking is kind of the productive pastoral language. But I never thought about it on terms of if you just start at the beginning, you might create all sorts of levers that lead to no action. So that first part is that. Second part is where are we right now? And then those things in the middle can be multiple places.
Yes.
And I'm looking at some of your paths right now on the wall. I mean, you're even seeing different triggers.
Yes.
Like sometimes something might happen and that leads to 3 places that it can go. Now this sounds, if you've never done this before and this sounds terribly like complicated to you, you've been doing this for a long time. Your team knows this thinking.
Yes.
Like does your board, like y'all have a leader group, do they understand this?
They do.
Okay, so this is core to y'all's operational identity. Okay.
Yes. That's one of the things, anytime we talk about starting something or helping or trying to do something, whatever it is, we're developing a pathway for it. If that's is what we want to end at, what are the steps we need to go to and where are we now?
Yeah.
And that's just, I mean, I think one of the mistakes that churches make is that we think there's just one pathway and this functions for everything. We don't do that. We have a pathway for every single thing, and every single one of them is different.
Yeah.
Some of them have a lot of steps, like the one you're looking at has a lot of steps. The one you're looking at is our discipleship pathway. So if you come in through a large group, we have one process. If you come in through a small group, our large group is our worship, monthly worship.
Yeah.
If you come in through a small group, we have another pathway. Eventually, they both connect. We have like a pathway for how do we create leaders. I mean, we have different pathways, and again, they're all different, but they all have the same basic pattern and beginning steps. So when it's simplified, I think that much, create pathways for anything, right? Create pathways for how to get people to come back, create pathways for how to grow. I think children's ministry, I mean, just whatever you want to do, create those pathways. And I think... So I think back, do you remember MapQuest? We used to like print the instructions to get the directions to get anywhere. And I always missed a turn or something, right? But just having something helped me get to where I was going. So even if our steps don't make sense or something falls apart, like one of the things that I love to do is tweak stuff all the time. So you and I talk about this a lot, but I'll create the pathway. We'll see what's working, what's not, then we'll go back and tweak it. So like, we don't have to sit down and spend hours and hours and months creating this like perfect pathway. Just put something together.
Yeah.
Your MapQuest instructions that something's going to go wrong.
Yeah.
But you can still get to your destination.
And I think that what you said is interesting about that. A lot of times there might be some reluctance to this because someone may have tried something along these lines and it didn't work. So they jettison the whole idea. Yeah. Whereas what it might just be is, okay, we've got this one weird thing, and this seems to be where stuff is tripping up. Let's talk about that one weird thing. Like just earlier today, I was showing you ConvertKit because Fernie's getting an email list together to talk about pathways. And, part of some of those email sequences are, depending on what somebody has done or not done, it shoots you into different tags and lists and things like that. And, sometimes you might realize, wow, this weird middle step is confusing people. But it's the same way here. So it's like, different question. Have y'all ever looked at the end result of all of your pathways to see collectively what the value set of a person would be if they have kind of fully processed through each pathway?
So someone like active in the church?
Yeah.
I don't know. Yes and no.
Okay.
There's a lot of things that I end up doing and Katie ends up doing that's like unofficial.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of things for us. One, I think at the end of every pathway, we put all of them together, people are going to understand our values as a church, our mission statement, our vision, and they're going to understand like the what it means to help bring about heaven, which is part of our mission statement. Yeah. So all of our pathways lead to that.
Yeah.
And I will say that like our leadership team, our core team, they all exhibit all of those things.
All those things, yeah.
And they've been through the majority of our pathways.
Yeah, that's what I was curious about, because you said you all have multiple pathways now. I was wondering, I wonder, is the end result of every pathway really just another pathway step towards the overall vision?
Yeah.
Okay, I figured so. Fernie thinks through everything, so I knew the answer to that question already. So, what do you feel like is the most important pathway that y'all have at your church right now?
I think it's our leadership pathway.
Yeah.
We, as far as getting people to come back, we have a pathway that we follow, and it's helped us. It's worked for us. But sometimes that happens unintentionally, right? By accident. We've got different pathways, but our leadership one, it helps us not just create leaders, but leaders who understand our mission. And that, I think, is important, because one of the things that I've seen at the different churches that I've worked at is there's a lot of leaders who are all trying to do their own thing, and they rarely agree with each other. And the church does a lot of stuff, but it's not all congruent. It doesn't all work together. And so it's kind of like, in those situations, the mission doesn't matter, the vision doesn't matter. We're just going to do as much as we possibly can.
Yeah.
And I've seen burnout happen so many times in situations like that. So in developing leaders and creating leaders for us, we're creating leaders, like I said earlier, they understand our mission, they know the vision, they know our values, and they become the type of leaders who put those things into practice. So when they're thinking about what do we do and what next steps do we have, what do we want to do next year, what curriculums do we want to do, they're thinking about all of that through the lens of mission, vision, values.
Yeah.
And that's just so helpful, because we're all using the same language, we're all moving towards the same goal. When they're on our leadership team. So yeah, that's our most important one in my mind.
We know there used to be tons of conversations about having, alignment among staff teams, leaders, that sort of a thing. And the old answer to the alignment problem was, well, just clarify who you are and be a better leader to keep people in line.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're really intentional about every single one of these pathways forming, it's almost as though it's a different subset of the same idea, and when you put all of the subsets together, you see a level of wholeness that the natural response is this culture for your church.
Yeah.
And so we're not just talking about simple things. A lot of times, folks ask me about systems all the time. Oh, what about systems? It's always that end result. What do you want? Let's step that backwards. But I think this conversation also helps you realize is that this is not just about a way to make sure payroll gets run, or a new visitor card gets sent. Like, I'm looking at some of your pathways and realizing the end result that so many folks struggle with is the second step on your pathway. And so there's no wonder that y'all have seen just this level. Okay, so a couple of technical questions. How do you keep count of people as they're part of these pathways? Do y'all keep up with that sort of thing?
Yeah, so they're all so we use Planning Center, and we create workflows in that.
Okay.
But I know most membership databases can do workflows.
Yeah.
And that's all it is. So once we have our pathway on paper, then we put that pathway on a electronic workflow on our database. And so for us, it makes it easy because we know what the steps are. We assign each of those steps to the different people that need to be assigned, and people go automatically through that without us having to be like, okay, you're on step 1.
Yeah.
Now you're on step 2. No, like, we're just helping them take those steps.
So all you're doing is, and that's what I love about, because I use Trello for so many things. Like the last episode or the couple episodes back was using Trello for things like this. And when me and Allison Sauls created a great, now I'm realizing it was a pathway, it just wasn't a system. But our visitor assimilation early on the days of Foundry, we use it in Trello because I'm such a visual thinker. I like to see that through there. But part of the ways this scales is you actually have a team. And I've used Planning Center workflows before. The second someone does their assigned task, it automatically moves that person to the next place, assigns the next task, notifies whoever that task is assigned to, and it automates. So there's things that you can do to cause a hiccup in the plan. But Planning Center for y'all seems to eliminate just much of that.
It does. And it sends us reminders when we haven't followed up with it, or we can write notes there for each other.
Yeah.
So, we've reached out to somebody, they just seem to have dropped off the planet, the face of the earth, stuff like that. Like, we're able to communicate that with each other as a team, and not just one person holding all of that information.
Yeah, which is when it tends to get lost. So, okay, what do you think is the favorite we'll wrap up this before we go into the next one. But what is your favorite pathway you've developed?
Ooh, that's a good question. It's actually our discipleship pathway. And I think the reason it's my favorite, there's a couple things. It gets lay people involved. So if, like we said earlier, we meet once a month for worship, which we call large group, and then weekly small groups. If a visitor comes in through a small group for their first time, which happens quite a bit, then that small group leader, those leaders are in charge of beginning their discipleship pathway.
Yeah.
So I love the fact that it's taken some of that stuff off of our hands.
Yeah.
And then we've also created resources that help people, like for that specific pathway, we created a devotional that goes with it. We talk about giving. There's different things that we talk about in that pathway that just really helps us talk about who we are as a church, but it also puts stuff in the hands of others. So the lay people get involved. By the time we get to these extra, like the devotional and stuff that we created, we put it in the hands of the guest, the person that's coming to visit, and they can start taking ownership of their own faith, of their own journey. And obviously we help them along through it. But just this idea of, I think sometimes we think that pathways have to be staff-led completely. And with that, when we really experimented with how do we get lay people involved? How do we get people who are just starting their journey involved? And it seems to be like doing well for us. So yeah, that's been my favorite one. I think that's the one we spent the most time on, and making resources for it, and designing the pathway, and then redesigning the pathway, and then figuring out how to do it in planning center. And yeah, that's been my favorite one.
Yeah. So what it sounds like I'm also hearing from you is at that point in time you have a person who. Okay, at what point in time? Well, at what point in time is someone leading one of your small groups? I mean, are they like deep into their mid-city journey, or is that a person that have just been coming for 6 to 8 months?
Yeah, even less.
Yeah. So very early on, they're given a level of responsibility about this intentionality.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. So our small groups, where our small groups function is that they tend to have two leaders. One is a seasoned leader who's been there at least a year. And so they kind of know how to run a small group. They understand the systems we use, all that kind of stuff. Then we always invite somebody to journey with them as a co-leader. And we have some people who have never been in a small group before who end up co-leaders because they're leaders in other parts of the church. They understand who we are as a church, our mission, vision, values. And so we invite them to be small group co-leaders. And the reason they are able to do that, I think, is our discipleship pathway has already given them an introduction to everything about who we are.
Yeah.
So it's easier for us to plug them into our leadership pathway. It's easier to plug them into, like when we get them through our guest visitor pathway, like it's easy to get them back. Like those kinds of things is just, it allows us to create leaders very quickly.
Yeah. And I think it's important also to say at this point, for some people, they might be hearing this and thinking, oh, wow, I love this. How do I implement this? Other people might be saying this feels icky. They're probably not listening by now. They probably turned the podcast off already. But there's a difference between intentionality and manipulation.
Yes.
And I know I've gotten this feedback before in the past, and we would get it, especially at Foundry. Some folks be like, wow, that just sounds like you're being. I think it's stewardship and faithfulness. Mm-hmm. That if when Jesus gives us people. And I do think that's the tiny little bit of Calvinistic thought I have. But if Jesus put somebody in front of us as ministry leaders, we're being trusted with that person. Mm-hmm. And if Jesus gives us something and entrusts us with it, we're typically going to be really intentional with it. And in our world now, so many folks, just because of our cultural moment, our media usage, all that, or just our failure to have healthy relationships in abundance, a lot of people don't really know what it means to be cared for. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then combine that with people, this is a side conversation, but when you're encountering somebody at Mid-City, I know a lot of y'all's folks are mid to late 20s, early 30s. Mm-hmm. There's a solid chance they've never been part of a church before, ever. Yeah. And we're no longer in an age where we can assume people know what things are.
Yeah.
And what things are. So we've got to create these paths. I mean, we've got to say, here's the trail to take.
Yeah. Well, and I'll say to that, because I get that whole manipulation question or comment. So So I think about Scripture. If we think about the early disciples that Jesus called, there's a pattern to them.
Yeah.
That's a pathway, right? I think about when Paul started planting churches and the way he would train people to plant churches and to stay there and lead the church after he's gone. Those are pathways, right? So I will admit that sometimes churches end up discipling people by accident.
Yeah.
But if we're going to be good stewards of people's money and time and that the calling that God has placed in our lives, then we have to be intentional, right? So I see it as kind of like practice, right? So if I want to learn how to play basketball in the NBA, there's a lot of steps I need to learn before I get there. It's not manipulation. It's just need to learn certain things to get there. And that's true about anything, right? I mean, that's that I can't think of a single thing, maybe you can, that doesn't require you to take some steps before you can actually get started on that, right? I mean, even a baby walking, right?
Yeah.
There's certain steps and milestones. And so if that's the way most of life around us works, why can't our faith work that way?
Yeah, and we could have a field day talking about Paul's missional strategy in the book of Acts. I would love to have that conversation. But we got to lead a workshop in a few hours, Fernie, so we don't have time for that. But I think that's true. I think that there's this fear we have, and especially our current cultural moment of church. It's rife with tales of abuse, of power, all these like super gnarly things. But we also know the dangers of throwing the baby out with the bathwater and saying, maybe some of these things happened because of a lack of intentionality and instead just this super hope and osmosis discipleship and growth. And, both me and you could also sit down and have a conversation about the stress that happens, especially in a church planting scenario, and the fear of just not. It's very easy to make bad decisions for the right reasons. And I think a lot of times in a lot of the stories that people are fearful of when they hear these sorts of things, that mind goes to it. And what you probably are going to find is a leader who felt the answer was always to work harder.
Yeah.
And not to work smarter. So we might get email comments back about that the last couple of minutes, but I feel like that's also part of this conversation is how do you see this as if you're in a place where you need to think through a specific growth pattern or you're hitting a ministry wall or your church is just stopped at one place, all these sorts of things, one of my answers now for people is we need to look at pathways. Yeah. And so.
Well, and if I can say, so one of the things that you've talked a lot about is how small is the new big, right? And I really do believe we've been trained to think that a successful church is one that has hundreds and thousands of people. But like the example you mentioned earlier, like that isn't necessarily the case today.
No.
And so I think for pastors who pastor, 60 to 150 people churches, instead of spending all of our time working harder to get the numbers to grow up and in a place that might never do that, if we can begin to measure, create these pathways that say people are growing in their faith. I mean, I'd rather have a church of 20 people that are growing in their faith, that are being leaders and growing the kingdom, and with our mission at Mid-City that are helping to bring about heaven on earth. I'd rather have that than 1,000 people who just come to church on Sunday morning and then go home and come back 7 days later unless they have vacation or something, right? Like these pathways help us remind us this is what's important in ministry, and because it's important, we're going to create paths and steps for people to get there, and that's going to be our focus. Are we helping people go through those paths, or are we just kind of sitting back and either sitting back and just like, let's see what happens, or working our tails off for stuff that isn't even producing anything good for our church?
And I think that's the place where a lot of pastors are at now is they're starting to realize they're at places where working harder is not producing any new results. Which you've heard me say for years, that was always my thing is like, might not be smart enough or I might not be smart, all these sorts of things, but I knew I can work harder than any of you in here. Which was great until working harder failed to work. And you want to talk about pastoral span of care. You don't want I'm very honest now. And I talked about it in a previous episode. I'm an extrovert. I love people. I love being around for all those sorts of things. But I've got a really small span of care. like, my span of care is actually in the dozens. I mean, maybe 30 people, and it kind of drops off. Well, I mean, do you want your church to be limited to the pastor's span of care? And if you're unintentional with this sort of thing, then the church will end up being your span of care.
Yeah.
And I don't think any of us want that's not faithful. No. That's not faithful stewardship. It's the ministry wall, and getting your leg over this wall, like with every ministry wall situation, you're not dropping back down to the same elevation once you get over. You're actually rising up to a new place. And it's a new situation. So before we move on to the second part, Fernie, which will come back next week, is there anything to close out this first conversation that you feel like we kind of have to put in the bucket before we move forward?
Well, I'll let you decide if you think it needs to be this or not. But so for the people who are hesitant about pathways still, and hesitant about the how rigid they are, or I've even heard people say they leave no room for the Holy Spirit. I hear that. I understand that. So I'll say this. So we have a guy at our church, Mr. Larry. He's 88 years old. He was really involved in his church for years, led Sunday school classes, preached at his church, like just very active. When he started coming to Mid-City Church, he's actually Katie's grandpa.
Okay. I was about to ask you, are you talking First Methodist Baton Rouge or Mid-City?
No,
I was like, no, he's saying Mid-City.
Yeah, Mid-City. He started joining one of our small groups. Well, first he started coming to worship all the time. Then started joining one of our small groups and just like kept taking those steps. And so there came a day when he wanted to become a member. And he hadn't gone through our pathway, right? And so I was thinking, am I really going to make this 88-year-old man who probably knows more about the Bible than I do, who shows up consistently?
It's Katie's grandpa,
and it's
man.
Katie's grandpa, yeah. And so, like in that instance, we superseded the pathway and said, let's leave room for the Holy Spirit, right?
Yeah.
So I am like a stickler for the pathways, but I also know that sometimes the Holy Spirit moves in ways that we have to put our pathway aside and just let the Holy Spirit move.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean just slack off all the time, but like if we're intentional, we can see the Holy Spirit moving, right?
And when it's time to do it,
yeah.
I tell folks all the time that systems are there for when things go haywire.
Yeah.
So you know how to get back on track when the time to get back on track is, which is the exact same thing that you just said.
Yeah.
And so structure is freeing. As Jocko Willink says, discipline equals freedom. And I think that there's just something about I think that Spirit will bless this level of intentionality. So we're gonna pause it right now. We're gonna come back next week, and we're gonna build a pathway here on the show and see how some of this stuff works live. So Fernie, thanks for being part of Productive Pastor again.
My pleasure. Thank you.
I told y'all, Fernie is awesome. Hope you caught the enthusiasm he has just for developing people, for seeing possibility, for the innovative ways that we can go around and have these things be part of our ministry. Now, do you have to go full tilt boogie on this? No. Your context is going to determine so many things, but if you've ever had that question, wow, we really just need a handful of more volunteers, or what does it take for us to be able to assimilate people into our church better? All of these sorts of struggle points, and I think especially the younger churches get, I feel like this is a level of intentionality that matters. You've heard me say it time and time again. Strategy only costs time, and strategy is one of the best resources that you can have out there. So go to the show notes, revchadbrooks.com/PPP/057. Grab Fernie's link. It's a workbook that he is giving out. And he's going to be doing a lot more stuff on pathways over the next few months, something he's really interested in. I would love to have you learn with me as I learn from my buddy Fernie. We'll be back in the next episode 58 next week, where we're going to build a pathway out on the episode. I'm going to tell you right now, this was not the one I thought we would do. It's not the way I thought it would go. But what was so funny, it was a problem that I had in ministry, a legitimate wall that I never managed to get my leg over, and Fernie instantly identified it in his own context and built out a fantastic system for what does it mean to do that. So come back next episode, come hang out in the Productive Pastor community on Facebook. Thanks for being part of things.